Okay, welcome back. Segment 4.3. In this little segment, we're going to talk about seed and startup financing. So that's the amount of money that you need when you are first getting your business launched. Some people make a distinction between the seed phase, which is the really, really, really early stage when you're just looking for your first financing, and the startup phase, which is just after the seed phase. But in general, they usually involve the same sources of financing, the same plus and minuses. So we're going to put them all together. And in many cases, people use them interchangeably in any case. So the seed and startup financing is the plan for today. By now, you should be almost sick of our little graphic that shows the different timeline and the cash flow on a business. But let's just review it really quickly so we can discuss the various stages of the company. First, we have the x-axis, which just refers to the passage of time. And then we have the y-axis, which is the total amount of money, either positive, which means you have money in the bank, or negative, which means you are in deficit or you owe money. And then we have our famous graph that shows how you spend down your initial endowment, if you have any, and then you start spending more and more money until finally you start earning money, in which case where you have your own resources that you have available. This part in the middle is the part that you need to cover eventually through all of your financing, because it's the total amount of money that you will be spending on your business. And then finally, once you break even, you recoup all of your prior investments, then you are making money again. Now let's talk about the different stages of financing here. So as we've previously discussed, you can break these into different stages. And there's no hard and fast rule for when these stages occur. But let's just say that a lot of people would tend to call this very early part the seed stage. And then they would call the next part the startup phase. Startup. And then they would call this third part the expansion phase, or the growth phase. So what we're looking at today is this early time period. Somewhere in here, when you are trying to get your business launched. So here's our big list of investors, and we've already visited this in the last segment, and we're going to focus now on the top of this list. So friends and family, crowdfunding, banks, foundations, startup competitions, and individual angels, and bootstrapping, of course. That's what we're going to talk about now. As you recall from the last segment, we made a list of each of the sources and roughly the range that you could expect of financing available, which again should be calibrated to your own economy. So, for example, this middle of the range here is 100,000. Which in many industrialized countries represents approximately 2 times the per capita GDP. Now, if you're in a country with a much higher GDP, then you could expect to raise more than that. And if you're in a country with a lower GDP per capita, then you'd expect to raise less than that. But it would still be roughly in that line. So, you might be able to get a loan, a bank loan, for roughly that amount of money, and you may be able to raise that amount of money from your friends and family, for example. Startup competition may be half that. Okay, so let's talk about each of these now and discuss what are some of the pluses and minuses of each of these things. First, we need to think about how are we going to evaluate all these various options that we have. It seems like there are so many things that we can do, so we need to be able to set some criteria up to decide between these various options. So let's talk about how to analyze your options. And we're looking at all these various sources. We need to ask ourselves 3 main questions. First is, what are the financial benefits and costs of this? what are the management costs and benefits, and what are the other intangible benefits and costs here. So we're gonna look at each of these in turn, and we're going to talk about each source and think about these different criteria for evaluating the source. So in terms of the financial criteria, the first question is, how much money can you raise? Obviously, you may need more or less money to run the operations of your business, and it might take more or less time. So that's why we say, how quickly are these things available? And then the time horizon on them. How soon do you need to pay back the investor or allow the investor to exit the business? And finally, are there actual costs to the source of financing? Then we look at the management criteria. For the management criteria, what we're looking for here is, can we get advice from the investor? Yes or no? It's not always going to be the case that you get advice, but you might need help in the founding process itself. So the really early stages, it might be nice to get some advice about what to do and how to set up the business. And then the second point is, can you get advice or support in the ongoing management of the business once it's been established? And then the third one might be, what sort of added value does the investor have? Does an affiliation with the investor give you a boost to your own reputation because of your affiliation with this prominent investor? And then finally, the last criteria are the intangible criteria, independence versus control of the business. On some of the sources, especially when you are selling equity in your business, then you are necessarily going to give up a little bit of your independence. You're going to give up a little bit of control over your business. And so you have to ask yourself, how much is that worth to you, to be completely independent versus to be partially independent? So you're giving up a little bit of control. That'll become more apparent later on when we talk about expansion financing. But even now, even in the seed startup stage, the independence issue is an important issue. And then finally, there's the degree of separation between the source and the team. In other words, the source of the investment might be to a lesser or greater extent associated with the founder and the founding team. You might be close with them, which can be complicated, as we're going to find out in a minute. Let's start with bootstrapping. Bootstrapping is when you finance the company's growth from the money that you gain in operating the company. And as you can see, the range that you can raise this way is unlimited, so that sounds great. Furthermore, you keep complete control over the company, and you don't have to share the decision-making rights with anybody. However, bootstrapping has a huge disadvantage, which is you must be running a profitable business now. If you're losing money, obviously, your business is not going to be throwing off the cash that you need to actually grow your business. So you actually have to have a positive cash flow from the very moment that you decide you want to use this as a source. And of course, you also don't get any advice or input from anyone else because you're basically just running your company. Okay, let's talk about friends and family now. This is where, you ask your Aunt Matilda or your grandmother or any of your friends or other loved ones or anyone else that you can think of to basically give you a gift, to give you money. Or if you can't get them to give you money, maybe you could get them to lend you money at a very reasonable interest rate. So some kind of below market, cheap loan interest rate. So this is the most typical source of financing for a new company. This is possibly the easiest, depending on your relations with your relatives. The amount that you can raise is, up to $250,000 or 5 times GDP per capita, depending on the economy. And a typical amount would be, say $25,000 or, 1/2 per capita GDP. It's quick, can be done in a week or two. A time horizon is long because most of your friends and family aren't going to ask you to pay them back immediately. And you get to keep control of your business. So you're not sharing decisions with anybody. You maintain the ownership of your company. Now, that sounds ideal, doesn't it? But the problem is that there's actually several disadvantages to this, which is, first of all, the amounts are on the smaller side. So you're not going to be able to go very far with a friends and family investment. Plus, a failure can hurt your personal relations, right? So, you go to see on a holiday, you see dinner with your Aunt Matilda. You've already asked her for her life savings, which she's given to you. And then she says, gee, I couldn't go, I had to sell my house and move into an apartment because I gave you all my money. So how's your business going? So it puts a lot of pressure on you. And if you turn around and say, oh, actually, yeah, sorry, my business didn't work out, hope you enjoy your new apartment. So you're basically putting your personal relations, you're kind of stretching them here if you're not successful with your company. So there's not a huge separation between the source and the founding team. And usually, if you're asking your grandmother for money, maybe your grandmother is a very successful entrepreneur. So that's great. They might be able to, she might be able to give you advice about how to grow your business. But most of the time, your friends and family members are not going to be able to advise you on the business. So as you can see, there are some very serious disadvantages to friends and family, along with many, many advantages. Now, we've already had a prior session in a prior module on crowdfunding, on the mechanics of setting up a crowdfunding proposal on a platform. But what we want to do in this particular segment is understand the plus and minuses of getting crowdfunding money in the first place. So, as you recall, it's when you go on an internet platform and you basically ask an anonymous crowd for money. In most cases, it's a gift. But it could also be you pre-selling your inventory, you pre-selling your prototypes. Occasionally, depending on the country, there's different rules about ownership of companies. How many people can possibly be investors at the same time before you need to be a public company? But occasionally, you will actually sell equity stakes to your crowdfunding investors. The amount is usually on the order of 1,000 to 100,000, say 2 times GDP per capita, but the typical amount is really very, very small, on the order of 7,000. Of course, companies have raised millions in certain crowdfunding campaigns, but those are relatively rare events, and usually those involve something that's almost really ready to go, a production that they're really pre-selling inventory on those cases. A time frame here is about 1 to 2 months, and the time horizon on all these things is relatively long, except in the case of pre-selling a prototype. We'll talk about that in a minute, but it can be relatively short for receiving a product in your hand. On the other hand, if it's a gift or if it's an equity investment, they're on a long time frame here. They're not looking to get repaid. They're not looking for an exit event in the near future. So what are the advantages here? The advantage is you maintain control of your company, which is very nice. It gives you the possibility of testing the market. You have a concept, you have a prototype, you're not sure if people would be interested in it, and here's a chance for you to actually put it out there and get feedback on it and see if people are willing to pay for it, because in many cases they will actually pre-buy your prototype before you put it into production. And the third advantage is you get a big audience. You get a lot of people noticing you, learning about your company, learning about your concept, and possibly helping you. So there's some very, very good advantages to crowdfunding platforms. Now, the disadvantages, the first one is, of course, we already mentioned it, it's a relatively small amount of money. So don't plan on, using a crowdfunding campaign to do this giant launch or to cover all of your costs. It's going to get you some feedback relatively early, and it's going to get you a relatively small amount of money to kind of keep you going through the next, few months type thing. If you don't execute, you can expect a major public relation problem, because now you've advertised to people on the internet, and if you don't do what you say you're going to do, then they're going to be complaining about you on the internet, and so it's going to really hurt your reputation. There have been lots of stories of people who pre-sold inventory and they didn't realize there's going to be some customs issues when they shipped it out of their own country, and then the people didn't receive it on time and started complaining, or they had to pay extra customs fees, and then they really, really were complaining. If you don't ship on time when you say you're going to, people don't forgive the production delays. They'll definitely come down and start saying bad things about you, and that's going to hurt your reputation of your company. So there's a risk here. There's a reputational risk. You have to be really, really ready and confident you can execute. Usually, the people making the investments in a crowdfunding platform are not going to give you advice. So you're not going to learn about founding your company, how to take it to the next level, etc., from any of these investors. These are more an anonymous crowd of investors that are basically giving you some resources you can work with. Okay, let's talk about banks now. Banks is where you go when you want to take out a loan. The bank lends you money, usually small amounts of money, on the order of 1,000. Of course, you can get up to a 500,000 maybe, or 10 times GDP per capita, but your typical amount is going to be much lower than that, more on the order of 25,000 or 1/2 GDP per capita. It takes about 1 to 2 months to get a loan, as the bank has to do all kinds of due diligence on you, and they also want to make sure that you're going to pay them back or that you are going to put up something as collateral. The time horizon on a bank loan, is usually relatively short term. So, talking about maybe 5 years or so, and the bank is going to be expected to get an interest payment during the whole term of the loan and either amortize the loan. In other words, you start paying the principal down during the loan period, or pay interest only and then pay back the whole loan at the end of the term. So you're on the hook, and the bank's time horizon is generally relatively on the shorter side. So what are the advantages of this? Well, of course, the control advantage is good. You don't have to share ownership or decision rights with anybody, and you keep control of your business. And for the ones who actually get the loans, you could say that the conservative nature of the bank's due diligence process probably is some sign that you've got a good company, that they're willing to lend to you, because they're relatively conservative. Banks are known to be conservative because they usually have to get the money back because they've lent the money out that they've received through deposits. So they definitely want to get repaid, which leads to the disadvantage, which is this commitment that you have is typically a monthly payment or a quarterly payment, and this is a commitment that drains your cash. You are on the hook, and if you don't pay back, they can start making your life difficult, take you to court, force you into bankruptcy, depending on the country, etc. So this is a real commitment. Once you borrow this money, you're on the hook to pay them back with interest on a regular basis over the term of the loan. The second one is, generally speaking, you're going to have to put up collateral. You may not have to, and you'll have to pay a much higher interest rate and a much lower term, much quicker term to pay back if you don't put up collateral. So the question is, are you really ready to put your house up as collateral for your business? Your business fails, you could be forced to sell your house or some other asset that you have to pay back the bank loan. So this is a big commitment, I would say. And generally speaking, the bank officers, etc., the people who make the loans, can't usually give you much advice on founding or managing your business. It's a purely financial transaction. So you have to be fairly confident that you are going to be making money over the term to be able to pay back the loan in a good period of time. So there's some major disadvantages here to a bank loan, although, as you can see, there are some advantages as well. A lot of people do try and get small loans at the beginning, and sometimes there are other government loan type programs that might have a slightly more advantageous, that might give you some break for the initial period, and then you start paying back after some initial period. But there are a lot of disadvantages to taking a loan. Let's talk about foundations and public organizations. Now, these are the organizations that you go to when you are looking for a grant or a gift. The amount is usually on the smaller side, 5,000, up to 200,000 or so, which could be up to 4 times GDP per capita. A typical amount would be more like 10,000. So, relatively small amounts of money. The time frame is not so great on this. It might take you 3 to 6 months to hear back from them, and not to mention you have to prepare yourself to get the grant. So the overall time frame is quite long on grant writing as a source of investment in your company. Time horizon, 5 to 8 years. That's just to say that the foundations are giving you a grant and they would like to see some results, and you may have to report back to them. Even if they don't ask for a financial return, you may have some pressure to perform to show that you've accomplished what you said you want to do in your grant. So what are the advantages here? Control, obviously, just like all the other grants and gifts, you maintain control of your company. This could be helpful if you have a pro-social business, if you have social entrepreneurship business, then foundations could be a great source because they may be more interested than, say, a bank in helping a pro-social business. So it's a very nice outlet for someone who is interested in social entrepreneurship. It gives you credibility. Receiving a grant from a big foundation is very good for your reputation. And of course, there's no cash drain because you don't usually have to pay back a grant. Now, the disadvantages here, as I already mentioned, it does take a long time to get a grant. And furthermore, you can't just apply to every single foundation that's out there. You have to really find a foundation that matches the mission of your startup. So if you have some kind of pro-social motive that's attacking disease control in a certain part of the world or something like that, then you have to find a foundation that's also interested in disease control. You can't just apply to any old foundation. So it's going to take a long time to find the right foundation, to sometimes get to know the people that work there, and to write something that's really, really targeted. So another disadvantage here is that it's sending out a kind of a generic grant application is usually not considered to be a great recipe for success. It's really hard to convert on those and actually get some money from a foundation. You have to really target it to the mission of the foundation. So again, relatively small amounts of money. Of course, it's grants. It's nice for social entrepreneurship, but it's going to take a long time, and you really have to tailor your message to the foundation, or find a foundation that's tailored already to what you are interested in doing. And now we address an age-old question. Should you enter a startup competition? It's hard to answer this question. You enter a contest, you pitch your idea in front of a room full of people, usually other entrepreneurs, and a jury which has some experts, entrepreneurs, or investors on it. And they evaluate your idea. They give you feedback. And if you're really, really good, you could receive a prize, which is often in the form of a gift. It could also be a loan, could be an in-kind contribution such as office space, and you could receive attention from the people in the audience. Sometimes investors sit in on these, even if they're not on the jury, and they actually can approach you afterwards and say, they're interested in making an investment in your company. So it's a nice way of getting exposure. The amounts are usually, again, relatively small. We're talking about $1,000 to $50,000, which is roughly GDP per capita in whatever economy. And typical amount might be 1/5 that, so say $10,000. Time frame is relatively short, so you enter the contest, you go in, you make your pitch, and usually this whole thing gets resolved within a month or so. Time horizon is very long because they're not interested in necessarily a return, especially if you've won a prize. It's just to help you get the business launched. So what are the advantages here? In the case of a real gift or a prize, you maintain control, as we've just discussed. Credibility and prestige you get a lot of. When you win these things, it does say something. It can be impressive, and it can be perhaps an entree into other investors. And you do get advice and input. You get advice right then and there from the jury. Sometimes people will approach you and give you unsolicited advice. And so you can actually test your ideas pretty well. And a lot of people even enter these contests with some new idea just to test it, try it out, and see what the people in the audience say. So it is a very good source of input. The big disadvantage here is you advertise your idea. So when you stand up there and you give your pitch, you're telling everybody what you're working on. And so depending on how easy it is to copy your idea, we'll talk more about that in the next module, it may or may not make sense to broadcast what you're doing. On the other hand, just to play the devil's advocate, most entrepreneurs over-exaggerate this issue. So they're very afraid of telling anybody their idea. Whereas, sort of serial entrepreneurs, people who have a lot of entrepreneurial experience, they would typically go ahead and tell the idea and then get the feedback because they know the feedback is going to improve the idea. So having an idea that's never tested on anybody because it's so secret, generally, occasionally you get lucky, but generally it's usually a bad idea. And then it gets improved by talking with people. So it is a disadvantage, though, in most entrepreneurs' mind. You have to discuss this and think about this amongst your founding team. One other disadvantage here is that a lot of founders will put a lot of effort into these business plan competitions. And what I've heard is that these competitions can be a distraction if you spend too much time trying to tailor the message to the competition. So better just to go out there and make things, get things sold, get things done, get prototypes built, than it is to focus on PowerPoint presentations, for a pitch competition. So, there are some advantages and disadvantages of this. Most people, I think, are relatively happy they entered these competitions. But on the other hand, you have to weigh the plus and minuses, the control, the credibility that you get, especially if you win, versus the dissemination of what it is you're working on. So here we're going to talk about angel investors, and we're going to distinguish between the angels and the angel groups. We'll talk more about the angel groups in the next segment, which is going to be on expansion and growth financing. And so now here we're going to focus more on the seed financing and startup financing aspect of it, which is you are going to pitch your idea and sell a share of your company to a wealthy individual. Usually it's somebody who's already been a successful entrepreneur who made money in their business and then who would like to help out other entrepreneurs. So it's really a nice match between people who have already been successful and people who need financing. These are equity-based investments. So that means you are going to sell a share of the company to the investor. The amount ranges here, usually starting on the order of 50,000 and going up to 500,000, which is 10 times GDP per capita. Typical amount might be half that maximum, so around 200,000 or so, 4 times GDP. Usually these can be accomplished in a month or two, and the time horizon that the angel has is relatively long, 5 to 10 years. They don't necessarily want to cash out of their investment straight away, but they do want to get a return on their investment at some point in the medium term. So, what are some of the advantages here? First one is you can receive input or advice from the angel. Now, depends on where the expertise of the angel is. If you have a good match between your sector and the angel sector, then you could actually receive some very, very good advice or input on how to found your business, how to build your business, how to manage your business. There's no collateral, there's no interest payments. So this is a pure equity investment. And, angel investors can take large risks because they're going to make these investments in several companies, and they may be willing to bet on somebody who's very ambitious, who's got a very good idea, and they may think they can help to get the business built up. So there are a lot of advantages here for angel investors. Disadvantages relative to a lot of the gifts and grants and et cetera that we've been talking about so far is you are going to now start relinquishing control. And in general, of course, if you sell equity, the more money you need for expansion, for growth, the more control you're going to have to give up. Also, the earlier that you start looking to raise larger amounts of money, the more control you're going to have to give up to entice the investors, because these early stage investments are highly risky. So to entice the investor, generally speaking, you have to give up more of your company in the early stages than you do in the later stages. So you're going to have to give up some control now. You're going to share some decision-making power with the angel. The person may be on your board of directors. They would have a stake in your company and have a say in what you do. So this is a psychological hurdle that a lot of entrepreneurs don't want to cross, but in many cases it is worth considering, especially if they can bring in the amount of money that you need to launch your business. Now, if the angel investor is inexperienced in your particular sector, this could be a big disadvantage. Aside from the fact that the advice may not be as good, it could actually be bad advice. So this is something that you need to think about, which is when you are raising money from an angel investor, it's highly preferable that this person be in the same sector as your business, that understands the sector, has a prior exit, a prior company in the same area, roughly in the same area, so the person understands what you're going through and what your market looks like, etc. If the person's very far away, a pretty big disadvantage is you start getting this advice, and the advice isn't really correct for your sector. That can lead to conflict, problems, bad moves on your part, etc. So these are some of the disadvantages of the angel investors. Although, as we see before, there are plenty of other advantages. Okay, so what we presented here is an overview of the sources of funding for seed and startup phases and the process that you have to go through. It's basically on one page everything we just discussed. Now what we did here is on this side we put the source of financing, and then what we did is we wrote in red ink we thought things that the entrepreneur should be aware of, and in green we thought some of the things that could be some of the pluses involved. So if you just look at friends and family, we're highlighting here the fact that, well, these are relatively small amounts of money. Actually, that goes for pretty much all of these first 5. If there's something wrong with your business, it could hurt your relationship. That's also related to the fact that there's not much of a separation between between the investor and your team. Basically, you know them; they're your relatives and friends. And in terms of input, you're not going to get much input from your friends and family, and probably not from your crowdfunding investors either. However, one thing that we see is about the independents is that you basically keep control whenever you have a gift or a grant. So that holds also for the first 5, because most of these are involving grants, loans, and gifts. So therefore, you're not actually selling equity. In terms of crowdfunding, we already discussed the amounts. You're not going to get a lot of input. And we just highlighted, if you recall, that it could be bad if you don't execute. In other words, reputation is good. You can say that you receive money on a crowdfunding platform. However, especially if you're pre-selling, be careful, because if you don't execute well, it could actually hurt your reputation. For banks, the key point here is that it drains your cash. You're on the hook to pay back that loan. On the other hand, their due diligence process means that if you are successful in getting a loan, that means they probably believe that you are going to have a successful business. Good for your reputation. Foundations, the big issue here is how long it takes to raise money from a foundation. 3 to 6 months is a lot of time in the life of a startup company. And you have to find an organization with the same mission. Startup competitions are great. You great advice. If you win it, you get great prestige. Good for your reputation. And on the downside, you are advertising what you're doing to the rest of the world. And then finally, with angels, of course, you can get input, and that's key. You give up equity, which is basically related to this idea that you need to relinquish control of your company. Not complete control, because most angel investors are not going to take over your business or have a majority of your shares. However, you're going to give up some kind of control. On the other hand, they're not going to ask for collateral, and you are going to be able to put the money to good use. So let's now look at an example of seed and startup financing, and then we'll see you very, very soon in the next segment, which is about growth and expansion financing. Thanks a lot.